Thank you, Mark and Emily, for that beautiful music. I'm Reverend Michelle Scott Huffman. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the minister here at First UU. When we decided several weeks ago that the topic for today's message would be inspired leadership, we had no idea that earlier in the week we would all watch with horror as the fruits of failed, fear-mongering, authoritarian leadership played out before our eyes. If there were a poignant, practical example of the reasons that we should be warned against the idolatries of the mind and spirit, as mentioned in our 5th UU source, we saw it this week. It was hard to watch, for sure. And as more images and video clips surface, many of us get sucked into the consumption of those images and find ourselves traumatized over and over again. Likewise, we may find ourselves doom scrolling, as some folks call it, on social media, and even being drawn into conversations that we wouldn't normally engage because our feelings about what we've seen this week are so strong. Many times those conversations result in deep despair over the words being shared by someone that we have known and loved and just can't understand, and sometimes they end in broken relationships. So friends, I want to encourage you to take good care of yourself, to take good care of each other, to those who are struggling with the barrage of more and more devastating information, and those who are feeling anxious and angry about conversations that you've had. Know that it's okay to step away. Remember to breathe. Take a deep cleansing breath as often as it comes to mind, and you'll train yourself to think of it more often. I invite you to try it now. Take a deep breath in as you feel the air go as deeply as you can fill your lungs. And then ask yourself, when was the last time I actually took a full breath? Especially in these tenuous times, we must tend to our spirits and our bodies. We must draw from the well of the spiritual resources that are within us and keep filling the well with regular spiritual practice. And don't let the phrase spiritual practice scare you off. Literally anything you do with the intention of caring for your spirit is a spiritual practice. Walking, reading, praying, meditating, yoga, writing, sewing, drawing, whatever it is. Any and all of it can fill your cup. And there's much more of you to give to the world when your cup is full. And sometimes dire circumstances call for a little levity. There were 2 times this week when I read something that prompted a hearty laugh, even though the realities behind the words were much more sad than funny. The first was reading a news article in which a prominent Missouri business owner, who shall remain nameless today, for all practical purposes, he has owned much of the Missouri legislature for quite a few years. And he called Senator Josh Hawley a political opportunist, which is probably true. But it was laughable in the moment because I can't think of a person who fits the description political opportunist better. So I think in this context, it was meant to be a negative, in spite of the fact that this person's money continually impacts legislation in the state of Missouri that in turn impacts his own business practices, and in some cases pending litigation. All of that to say the moral high ground got crowded this week. And hopefully some of the folks that suddenly found themselves there will take some time to look around, decide they like it there, and spend a little more time there. The other thing that made me chuckle was when Parker Palmer wrote in response to one of his posts this week, that one reader responding to his post said, "Go to hell." He said, it's not the first time he's been given that kind of travel advice since 2016. And he writes, "I admired her editorial brevity and exemplary spelling, both of which are rare these days. So I replied in kind with, already there." Given the many ways that the current state of our country, our world, and certainly the health of our planet feels something akin to hell on earth, which, by the way, in my theological understanding, is the only hell there is. But given this feeling of being so far off the path, with so many people experiencing hopelessness and despair, we are in a moment that calls for inspired leadership at every level. Many of us have great hope that things are about to change in lots of ways, but most of us also realize that no political party, no politician can fix all that is broken. And hopefully we also recognize that our own lens through which we identify what is broken and how it might be fixed is very limited and incomplete. We need each other to paint a more complete picture, both of what is wrong and of the possibilities for repair, healing, and wholeness. Having a more complete picture allows us to work at solutions that are both realistic and hopeful. Listening to a podcast conversation this week between Brene Brown and Barack Obama, I was reminded of something called the Stockdale Paradox, which Jim Collins writes about in his book, Good to Great. Admiral Jim Stockdale was a U.S. military officer held captive for 8 years during the Vietnam War. He was tortured more than 20 times by his captors and never had much reason to believe that he would survive the prison camp and someday return home to see his wife. While he had a remarkable faith in the unknowable, he noted that it was always the most optimistic of his prison mates who failed to make it out alive. He writes, they were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas, and Christmas would come and go. Then they'd say, we'll be out by Easter, and Easter would come and go, and then Thanksgiving, and then it would be Christmas again, and they died of a broken heart. Stockdale knew he was in hell, but rather than bury his head in the sand, he stepped up and did everything he could to lift the morale and prolong the lives of his fellow prisoners. His philosophy and tool for survival has come to be called the Stockdale Paradox, and it is simply this. You must retain faith that you will prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties, and at the same time, you must confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. And so, with eyes wide open to the realities around us, from blatant, unashamed white supremacy in plain view in individual and group actions to the more implicit, embedded white supremacy that exists in nearly every institution in this country, to include our own congregation. From the glaring homophobia and transphobia that shows up on signs in street protests, to the whispered coded language around bathrooms and pronouns that continues to marginalize and dehumanize. A widening gap between the rich and the poor, continued assumptions about poverty that cause even well-meaning liberals to perpetuate systems of economic violence, a broken mental health care system, readily available only to those who have funds and figure out how to navigate it, and accessed often through a run-in with law enforcement, ill-equipped to handle the situation, which too often turns violent or deadly. Institutions that reward and reinforce racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, and a whole host of other isms. These are but some of the most brutal facts of our current reality. And yet, our guiding principles consistently offer another way. I know lots of us know them, but some don't. And especially this week, I found myself needing to be reminded, so that I could ask the hard questions about whether I was living up to them. To these principles of Unitarian Universalism, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in our congregations and in society, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Reviewing those principles this week called me to have hope and also to interrogate myself, my judgments, my practices, my feelings about what was happening, and to imagine the ways that I could exercise inspired leadership in the face of our current reality. In other words, there is hope, and there are leaders who have their eyes wide open to reality and are still reaching toward that hope because their systems of belief and patterns of behavior bear out the truth that change is possible. Maya Angelou once said that if one is lucky, a solitary fantasy can totally transform a million realities. I don't think that Maya Angelou was a person disconnected from reality, and yet her honest, hopeful words continue to inspire us. It is, in fact, having faced our reality head on that inspires us to work together for change. And so as we think today about inspired leadership and using our imagination to get there, I want to share with you some words that I've heard from members of this congregation in the past week about inspired leadership. Inspired leadership makes room for the stories that are absent or those that are overshadowed by a dominant narrative. It stretches our minds, our imaginations, our relationships, and even our resources to push us to imagine that we can do more, we can gather more, we can use more to bless the world around us. It values connection. It's collaborative. We can do infinitely more together than any of us can do on our own. Inspired leadership sees the pain and leans into it rather than running away from it. It pays attention, it's given away and shared. Inspired leadership looks to build something bigger than the container that it is in. And inspired leadership has an ability to hold complex realities in tension. So I want to invite you to participate in this conversation in the chat box by sharing characteristics of inspired leadership that are important to you. And while you're doing that, I'll share a story. Just yesterday, I read this Facebook post from someone named David Richards that was written on January 5th. For anyone who isn't on TikTok, I wanted to share a story. 1 week ago, a TikTok user with Parkinson's posted a video expressing anger over how tiny the pills for treating Parkinson's are, because it makes them really difficult to pick up when someone has something like, Parkinson's. 4 days ago, a guy who directs country music videos for a living and was previously most famous on TikTok for knowing obscure facts about Snapple, taught himself how to use Fusion 360, a design and modeling tool, so he could design a pill bottle that solves the problem. Problem was, though, that he didn't have a 3D printer, so he posted a video of his design and offered to share schematics with anyone who wanted to test it and/or improve upon it. All schematics are open source. 3 days ago, dozens of engineers and 3D printer enthusiasts had begun working on the project and started refining and tweaking to get tolerances where they needed to be and ensuring that it actually met the needs of those it was being designed for. 13 hours ago, at the time of writing, there was a working prototype. It has less plastic than your average McDonald's toy and should be priced as such. The original designer has gotten a patent attorney to ensure it remains open source, and the patent itself will be donated to the Michael J. Fox Foundation. In the meantime, for anyone who needs one now and doesn't want to wait until the manufacturing and scale begins, they can get one at cost from the engineers printing at home. I was incredibly inspired by that story of a need presenting itself. Someone who didn't know the person in need, didn't share their experience, probably didn't even understand it, felt that they had the resources, the skills, and the ability to meet that need, and they stepped in. And then they didn't try to own it. They did the piece that was theirs, and then they handed it off to the next person who could do the next piece that they didn't have the skills or the resources for. And together, all of these people who don't know the original person in need has met his need and the needs of many, many other people. in a way that inspired me to believe that this world really is a good place, that people really are wonderful, and that we have the ability to make huge differences in each other's lives, that we have the ability to bring positive change. May we be so aware of the struggles of others and so responsive and willing to ask the question about what is ours to do, and ready to imagine that what is ours is more than we originally thought, and will connect with the call of others to bring real solutions, great progress, and deeper transformation. This is inspired leadership. This is our call in 2021. And this is something I believe we can do. Blessed be, and amen. Our interlude is Creative Spirit, performed by the